Welcome to GB24, keeping you connected 24/7.
Welcome to GB24 News. I'm your host Joel Prasad.
And I'm your host Rick Raj.
And today's topic will be on adventure tourism. So we're looking at canoeing, kayaking, hiking, and also whitewater rafting.
You know, Joel, it's a really interesting topic that you bring forward for our viewers because there are a lot of hospitality graduates coming out in our today's world. And adventure tourism is still an unnurtured market, so it'll be really important for them to understand the tricks and traits of that business and exploit it to increase their profit share and market share.
Yeah, most definitely. But first we need to identify who these consumers are, what drives them, what are their motivations, and the risks involved.
Yeah, very nicely said. First, before we go any further understanding the motivation or risk, we need to understand what is a typical consumer like. So for that, we have a very educated expert on this field, Julia.
Thanks, guys. So adventure tourism is growing every day. There are about 15 million participants every year, which means that it's growing really quickly. From the studies that have been done, we can say that there are about 2.6 million that are Canadians. About 56% of these 2.6 million are Canadian males. And from these males, they are from the age of 18 to 24, averaging about 36 years of age. They also make about $39,000 a year, and about 44% of these participants either like canoeing or kayaking. So because the industry is growing so fast, there aren't a lot of studies that are covering adventure tourism in general with canoeing, kayaking, hiking. So unfortunately, there isn't a concrete definition of what adventure tourism is. So we can define it as an individual's interpretation that changes continuously even after the lived experience. So ultimately, it can be defined as experiences that involve problem solving, testing skills, meaningful social interactions, also stress management, exhilaration, excitement, and accomplishment of doing the sport, whether it's canoeing, like I said, hiking, or kayaking. So one of the biggest challenges that an operator will have to endure is the consumer's expectations. An expectation is going to be different from every consumer. So this is going to be the biggest thing that an operator is going to have to endure to make sure that they can either change it, improve it, or make it even better, because that's the only thing they're going to have to be working with. So that's about it. Back to you guys.
Thanks, Julia. You know, Joel, what Julia said does make a lot of sense. We don't notice that often, but from now onwards, you'll definitely keep an eye that adventure tourism is male-dominated sport. Now, we've understood what a typical consumer looks like, so what next?
Well, next we got to understand the motivations behind it. What motivates these consumers to partake in such activities?
You know, general motivations are around self-discovery to environmental beauty, but I'm no expert on this, so I'll introduce an expert who knows this stuff better than anybody else. Get time.
Get over to you.
Thanks, guys. You're right. Natural surroundings and self-discovery are two of the highest ranking motivational factors for these kind of sports. In fact, the way we describe self-discovery is the ability to fulfill one's ambitions and desires through one's own effort while discovering who they are at the same time. Whereas natural surroundings is a motivational factor where people go out and want to intake the beautiful surroundings and observe wildlife. Additional motivational factors include gaining cultural experiences and social benefits. It's interesting to see how these motivational factors vary from each person, but that's how it is for motivational factors. They're never the same. Anyways, back to you guys.
Thank you, Gek, for the wonderful insight on motivations behind adventure tourism. So now we know the typical consumers of this. We know some of the motivations, and now we need to determine the X factor. So what is the X factor for these operations to determine how they can take this to the next level?
Right, so Joel, X factors could be described as your unordinary factors on which our consumers or our viewers could utilize to increase their profit share or market share when they're actually in the market with the businesses. So X factors are something such as convenience, hydraulic stimulators, which are very new to the market. So to talk more about these X factors, I led Michael Offey to come in and intervene and to describe our viewers what these X factors generally consist of. So over to you, Mike.
Thank you, guys. Some of those important factors include social interactions, consumer perception, and destination loyalty to increase profit margins and market share when venturing into a new market. A study conducted on the social world of kayaking proposes that consumers would rather participate in supervised water surface activities than venture out on their own. Areas which operators should focus on include accessible parking lots, walking corridors, and facilities that offer hydrological stimulation, which provide consumers with an artificial environment to assist with the learning process. These activities are also effective in acquainting and uniting patrons before the service consumption to comfort participants who are a little bit concerned with the perceived risks of the activity. According to a study conducted by Wolven and Allison, consumers are more likely to partake in kayaking trips if a company is registered in a governing body. In Canada, aquatic recreation is regulated under the Small Vessels Act. Membership to a governing body such as Ontario Recreational Canoe and Kayaking Association would impact safety perceptions positively. Positive perceptions could potentially influence repeat visitors and create destination loyalty. A developed market like Georgian Bay's has a set reputation and should make it easier for consumers to identify with it through the use of marketing campaigns. A study conducted by Bricker and Kerstetter found that 24% of novice consumers rely on marketing campaigns to make their purchase decisions. Back to you guys.
Thank you, Lofty. Now we have a clear insight on the customers of adventure tourism. I can only imagine the amount of risks that are associated with these type of activities.
You're right, Joel. There are actually a lot of risks associated with these activities, but at the end of the day, let's face it, these are really risky activities. So the operators not only have to ensure a good safety for their employees, but they have to ensure good safety for their customers too. So talking more about the subject, we have Julia, who will talk more about risk in general and introduce this topic to our viewers.
Many adventure tourism companies should consider risk management. Poor risk management can result in negative outcomes which would reflect on the industry. A key component to consider is the interaction between consumer and the natural environment. Participants should be aware of the risks associated with the materials involved. These risk factors can also influence choosing destinations. Studies show that the main factor that influenced the decision-making process was political instability, followed by health and safety. There are two risk groups to consider: independent and commercial. Independent travelers are those who travel alone, and commercial tourists are those who travel through an operator. Whether they are one or the other, operators should consider all risks, especially injuries.
So to add on to what Julia was saying, according to one study, half of serious injuries related to adventure tourism resulted from water-based activities. In fact, according to the study, whitewater rafting usually results in injuries such as broken limbs, head injuries, fatalities, facial injuries, and lacerations. Whereas for kayaking, the injuries that are more common tend to be hypothermia, sprains, and shoulder injuries. These are important injuries for our viewers to keep in mind and to just watch out when they are out on the waters. Therefore, be careful, guys.
Wow, thank you for that. As you can see, there are some serious injuries involved in adventure tourism.
Very truly said, Joel. Not only these injuries, but there are other liabilities that can occur other than injuries to the operators, which they have to keep in mind. Other liabilities such as weather conditions, although they would lead in injuries, but the source of these injuries is uncontrollable for operators because they can't control weather, right? So to talk more about this, we have Mike who will shed more light on this.
Thank you, gentlemen. Weather hazards such as lightning present many dangers to those who participate in recreational sports activities. An estimated 1,000 people per year are killed worldwide due to lightning strikes. According to Environment Canada, Georgian Bay is prone to a high rate of lightning strikes. But not to worry, improvements in technology have presented lightning detectors, predictors, and monitors to lessen the casualties. A high liability associated with the adventure tourism industry requires waivers of liability that relieves a person or a company from liabilities for incurred injuries due to negligence. A well-written liability release form should be clear, concise, and considerate of language barriers. Finally, the form should include an indemnification clause to protect operators from an obligation of paying for any loss or damages incurred by participants. Back to you guys.
Right, so thank you, Mike. So to talk to you guys more about the practical world of the risk and liabilities associated with kayaking, let me introduce some legal cases and regulations that actually govern the sport. So in terms of regulation, there are three major regulations governing kayaking today. Alright, so the first act is the Small Vessels Regulation Act. It's actually the part of the Canadian Shipping Act of 2001. This act is a major governing act in sports and activities in this field. What this act basically covers is everything from the shipping size to any certification you need on your ship to basically run it in a practical world. So the second act is the Maritime Safety Act. What this act has basically two major categories for operators to know. The first category is that the operator should not operate the ship if it's in an unsafe or it's not in a proper condition. They'll be held liable for that. The second major category is that operator of the boat should not practice any unsafe practices or make any risky maneuvers that could provide danger to the participants and the employees themselves. The third act is the Commercial Safety Act, which basically says that any legal loss of life or any injury, serious injury, has to be reported to RCMP within 24 hours. If not done, a fine of $2,000 and an imprisonment of 6 months can be imposed on you. So you better watch out for that act. Right, so to talk to you guys about cases relevant in the topic today, we basically divided our cases into three parts: waivers, operational liability, and negligence resulting from any negligent act committed by the operator. So in waivers is actually a very useful tool to mitigate your liability only if the waiver is typed correctly. So in the case of Sanders versus Laurel Highland River Tours, the courts actually upheld the waiver even after there was a loss of life in the incident. It was only because that the waivers were excellently typed and the operator were able to prove that the customer actually understood the limitations of the waiver and the injuries that could result from him participating in the activity. So the next topic is operational liability. Operational liability is basically any liability occurring from the equipment present in your company. So for example, in a case of Chamberlain versus Fleming, a poorly maintained powerboat resulted into loss of life for many people traveling on that boat. The case went to the courts. They actually held the company liable because they didn't maintain the powerboat nicely, and that was the reason why there was an accident. Right, so the next category is negligence. In this category, I'm going to share a very important case that set precedent in this industry. It was the case that happened in 1994 in the Great Britain of R versus Kite and OLL Limited. This was actually the first case of its kind where a lack of education in the tour operators resulted into loss of life of around 4 children traveling in the boat. After that case, nothing remained the same. Everything changed. And so we could see that all these cases have had their impact on the way we do our activities. So as an operator, you gotta keep in mind that you gotta learn from the mistakes done by the previous operators or the previous employees and improve on them. So in our first-hand research, we collected 28 surveys of 14 males and 14 females. The questions range from their participation towards their motivation towards risk associated with that activity. Right, so the results from our first research survey found a high correlation between the first time and repeat participation if the customers were satisfied, a high correlation between self-discovery and keeping an open mind when you're doing these activities, and the perception of risk and its effect on participation. So what this basically means is that a strong correlation between these means that if an activity is done, it'll have a significant impact on the other activity that follows. So for example, first time and repeat participation. If the customers are satisfied the first time, there's a highly significant chance that they'll come back to your organization too. We also conducted a hypothesis which basically states that there is a direct relationship between an income group of a consumer and the money they spend. So you could see here that kayaking scored higher than whitewater rafting and canoeing. We also collected quantitative data to better explain this result, and what we found was the reason why these two things scored lower than kayaking was because consumer had a higher risk perception in whitewater rafting and they had a lack of knowledge in canoeing. So any operators providing those activities need to take care of those issues coming up in consumers' mind. Right, so the next thing you see is basically a pie graph which shows the outer ring of males and the inner ring of females. Right, so the next result basically shows you the motivational factors between consumers and between males and females. The highest rated was obviously self-discovery from both of them, as you can see, and now you could see that the line graph, it better depicts on what they are saying. Right, so in conclusion, we hope that we were able to explain to you what adventure tourism is and possibly warn you about the liabilities associated with adventure tourism. Hope you find this helpful. So long, till now, your host Rick Roach.